Welcome everybody, thank you for coming to tonight's graduate student talk. My name is Elizabeth Ponce, I'm the Public Programs Coordinator here at the List Visual Arts Center. Some of you may have come to these before, so you might already be familiar, but this series is just a way for us to bridge the gap between some research that's going on across campus and the visual art exhibitions we have here in our galleries. So tonight we are joined by Kartik Chandra from the MIT CSAIL lab, the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab. Kartik has research that revolves around human-like artificial intelligence, and tonight he will be sharing some of his research with us as it relates to the exhibition that we are looking at by the artist Alison Nguyen. So this is List Projects 26 here in our Bacalar Gallery. This is Alison's first institutional solo show, so we're really excited to have her and excited to have Kartik share a little bit about his research and shed some light on Alison's work. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over. Enjoy.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thank you all for coming here. It's such a pleasure and such a privilege to be here this evening at the List Center in this gallery. I was invited to give a talk about my research in relation to Alison's work, this film, History as Hypnosis, that you're seeing kind of all around me right now. But this invitation was extended in this past fall, I think around September or October. And at that time, this work didn't really exist in this form. It was in post-production, and even though the gallery here, the exhibition had been announced, it hadn't opened yet. In fact, it only opened a few weeks ago. So how do you write a talk about a film that hasn't been completed yet? Well, I did, I think, what any rational person would do in this historic moment, which is I typed Alison Nguyen's name into Google search, and I read what the search engine gave me, and here's what it told me. It told me Alison Nguyen's a filmmaker, an acclaimed, very talented filmmaker. It also very helpfully curated for me this gallery or this collage of headshots of Alison, pictures of her face. I could associate a face with that name. And as I think people want to do, I kind of looked in closer to the monitor and started looking at those pictures. And the first one is the first picture on your handout. So there are three people there. They're starring in this film, and the one on the left is Alison. And I clicked through and I discovered that this is a production still from the production of this film. So they're presumably looking into the camera, kind of gauging or judging whether this shot they just took is, it hits right, if it's resonating the way they want it to with an audience. So I was like, great, Alison Nguyen, real person, real filmmaker, real films, all of the scans, the pieces fit together. Then I kept scrolling and I got to the next picture, and that's the next picture on your handout, actually. And when I looked at this, something stuck out to me. I was like, this is not a photograph. It doesn't look like a photograph of a real person. It looks like something else. It looks like it's maybe a scene from a video game or some sort of computer rendering. So I was kind of intrigued by what was going on there, and I clicked through, and I learned that this was a still from an older film of Alison's called My Favorite Software is Being Here, which I think is a lovely name for a film. And that figure in the film is modeled on Alison, but it is not Alison. It's this 3D model. I have to say, I didn't have to click through to know that there was something non-photographic about this image. This image was, clearly not a photograph. And you might ask me, Kartik, but how did you know that? And I'd say, well, I don't know. Seeing is believing. You look at it and you know something's off. Do you need more than that? Well, okay. If you do need more than that, I could offer you some analysis as someone who studies visual computing, human vision, computer graphics. I I would look at that picture and, maybe look at the smoothie cup all the way on the left. There's this plastic cup with like a beverage in it, and look at the domed cap of that smoothie cup. Look how perfect that dome is. The plastic is so clear, almost crystalline in its perfection. When I get a smoothie and I put the lid on the cup, I inevitably leave a thumbprint or crumple it a little bit. That's just reality, but not in that image. It's so pixel perfect, so obedient to the laws of optics as we know them. There's something suspicious about that right away, I think. Or look at that bag of chips on the bottom left. Again, so perfect, so symmetric. It has this kind of, I think, William Blake, like fearful symmetry about it. I don't know, have you ever seen a bag of chips like that? It's like the platonic ideal of a bag of chips. But even then, like, look closer. If you bring it closer to your face, I will point out to you that those perfect arcs over the top are not so perfect after all. You can see there are these line segments that meet at sharp corners, which is not how curves work. And of course, like that bag of chips inside the computer is modeled not as this curved surface, but rather as this patchwork of triangles that mesh together. And where these triangles touch each other, of course, necessarily those creases need to be sharp. So that's the bag. Moving on now to the figure in the center of the picture, I want you to look first at her shirt, at the neckline, and you'll note that it's a little bit displaced from her skin, from her body, but it doesn't cast a shadow because the 3D engine that was used to render this image, and I believe Alison used Maya to do this, it chose not to render the shadows. It turns out that shadows make the task of generating computer graphics much, much more complicated because anything could conceivably cast light or cast shadow on anything else. And so often as just a computational shortcut or an optimization, we turn off the shadows. And I'm not saying that it's not possible to generate shadows. I'm not saying it's not possible to generate more lifelike images. In fact, the state of the art in computer graphics is such that the best images we can create are indistinguishable to certainly the amateur eye, but also to the expert trained eye from reality. We can create, perfect photorealism in our images, but Alison chose not to do that here, and I'm going to leave to you to reflect on why that might be. So the shadow on her neckline, or lack thereof, another clue. And finally, moving to her face, the face of that character. Something might strike you as not quite photographic about it, not quite real. And what is that? Well, again, I would start by saying seeing is believing. If you think there's something up with it, like trust that. But if you insist on an explanation, I would say, well, human skin out here in the real world is this marvelous, incredible organ consisting of many layers. I'm looking at my skin right now. One thing about human skin that you may or may not know, but certainly is very important in computer graphics, is that when a ray of light kind of collides with our skin, it doesn't ricochet off violently as it would from something like ceramic or plastic or rubber, which, thinking more about it, that face resembles, I think. Instead, the light kind of gently burrows in and emerges often from some entirely different part of the skin. So, if I take the flashlight on my phone and I just turn it on, there's a source of light, and if I touch it to my skin, you'll see my finger kind of light up, and that's evidence that the light is traveling through my skin. In computer graphics, we call this subsurface scattering, which is to say the light scatters under the surface of our skin. So, okay, if you asked me, Kartik, why did the algorithm that is curating these images of Alison, why was it fooled? What did it miss that it put this, video game-esque, like 3D rendering besides real photographs? I could say It missed the smoothie cup. It missed the bag of chips. It missed the lack of shadow, and it missed the skin, the subsurface scattering. Or if I were to compress all of that, if I were to say it in brief, I would say it missed that we are luminous beings. We are part of, and we participate in the transport of light through this world. And not just with our eyes, because if you close your eyes and you turn your face to the sun, which is, something you can do outside today, the world will turn red, just like this. And that's because our eyelids are not ceramic or rubber or plastic. So when a ray of light from the sun comes to our eyelids, it does not ricochet off violently, but instead burrows gently in through and turns the world red for us. Or if we turn away from the sun altogether, which is something you might sometimes want to do, you will feel its warmth on your back. Helen Keller writes about this beautifully in her autobiography, The Story of My Life. We are luminous beings. We are part of, and we participate in the transport of light through this world. Okay, so that's what the algorithm missed. It missed the cup, and it missed the chips, and it missed the neck, and it missed the skin, and it missed the luminosity of human existence in this world. But you might still ask, why did it miss that? This algorithm does phenomenally well in the real world. Most of the time it does great. You might ask, what's going on? You've told me what it missed, but you haven't told me why. And my answer to that revolves around this question of common sense. It's something my lab studies in many ways, common sense, as kind of this thing that we have. It maybe is a hallmark of intelligence, but when I'm talking about common sense right now, I want you to think about something different. I don't want you to think of common sense as something that is trivial or easy or a no-brainer. Actually, kind of the opposite. I want you to think of common sense as like an all-brainer. So common, what does common mean to me? Well, it means shared. By common, I'm not using this as like a disparaging remark, like common, Shakespeare writes about, his anti-democratic characters often speak of the common man and his bad breath, right? That's not what I mean. I mean common, like the Boston Common, community. Common means shared. And sense, I don't mean intellect. I don't mean street smarts by sense. By sense, I mean perception, which is to say the interface between the external and the internal. Sense is how we make contact with the world. And so when I talk about common sense, at least for the purposes of this talk, I am talking about the fact that we share how we perceive the world. We share that. We see the world the same. We fall prey to the same optical illusions, and that connects us. And you might say, okay, Kartik, sure, in principle that sounds great, but haven't you heard of color blindness? Haven't you heard of hearing loss or perfect pitch or anosmia or prosopagnosia, which is face blindness? Haven't you heard of any of these conditions that might separate our senses? And I'd say yes, it's true. I have heard of them, but I would say that the differences that separate us person to person are nothing in the face of the vast gulf that seems to separate us from even our best algorithms right now. And again, our best computer perception, computer vision algorithms perform extremely well, but they often seem to lack what we would call common sense. So for example, face recognition we would call largely a solved problem. We can recognize faces with very high precision, but if I take, again, my trusty flashlight and I put it under my face, it casts these strange shadows, and you all still know there's a face here, and you wouldn't be fooled even if that shadow were very dramatic, even if it were kind of hard-boiled. But a lot of computer vision algorithms would easily be fooled by something like that. One of my favorite works of art is this series of paintings produced by a Korean artistic duo in 2012, where they take a canvas and they train a video camera on it, and they have artists paint portraits of figures under the condition that if the camera recognizes a face, you have to stop. So the camcorder must not recognize a face. And the results are these, I think, beautiful expressions of the human countenance that are invisible to, again, even some of our most deployed computer vision algorithms. So I do think there's this gulf between our sense and algorithms. And you might ask, well, what's at stake there? Why does that matter? And I think this has something to teach us about the arts. We're here at the List Arts Center. I think it has something to teach us about art in a world where we are coming to terms with what it means to have algorithms that can produce images, say, in the style of an artist, or draw me a tree, or draw me a car. If a computer algorithm can do this, is it doing art? Much has been said about this question. Much has been said about the ethics of even asking this question. There's a lot at stake when we talk about these algorithms. I'm not here today to either, talk about the ethics or defend these products in any. I'm not going to talk about that. I just want to say that thinking about common sense, I think, gives us one way to think about what it means to create a work of art. And why is that? Well, some of you in the audience I recognize are trained artists. Others might not be, but I think everyone here, if I gave you a crayon and a piece of paper, you could draw me a tree. You could draw trunk and leaves, right? Like this is not very advanced. And all of us here would recognize that as a tree, even though if we were to compare these kind of on a pixel by pixel basis, if we were to really look at that, we would say these are nothing alike. The tree in the picture, for starters, is green, but I handed you a blue crayon, but it still looks like a tree to us. Where does that come from? How does that work? Well, one answer to that might be culturally, over centuries, if not millennia, we've come up with this language of pictorial representation. We've kind of converged on these ways of using lines and strokes to represent things that cannot possibly be represented just by lines and strokes, such as a tree, which has kind of this endless complexity to it. There's evidence, though, that is not the case. Perhaps most dramatically, to me at least, there's this paper from 1962 where a psychologist couple, Hochberg and Brooks, raised their child without access to pictorial representation. So when they would feed this baby, they would take off the label from the baby food jar because there was a cartoon on it. Can't have the child exposed to representation. And at 19 months, they tested this child on pictorial representations, and they found, sure enough, this child could recognize images that are pictorially represented, with line drawings and such. So, okay, grant me that maybe there is something in our perception. Let's call it maybe common sense. We share this, that we can look at a line drawing and we can recognize objects, see depth in that. What does that mean for art? Well, one of my role models here at CSAIL, a professor named Fredo Durand, often writes about the art-making process as the work of discovering what strokes it would take to get a person to see the tree, because it's not obvious, it's not clear what you have to do, but the artist has to, figure out that, hey, these two parallel strokes will give the impression of a tree. That's a hard problem. It's not clear, but it's something we do, and Fredo says this is the essence of depiction, is not just to take the real world and kind of splat it onto a two-dimensional canvas, but rather very carefully and intentionally and deliberately to choose strokes to create an impression in the mind of the audience. And note that to do this, you have to have something in common with the mind that will be viewing, because how else could you possibly gauge what would create that impression? So common sense here is paramount. I've thought a lot about this problem from a computational perspective, like how do you actually operationalize this? Vision itself is hard enough, but now to say, well, cause vision turns out to be a very challenging problem, and I've spent months and years thinking about it. I want to give you one more example of this, though, not for visual art making, but rather for storytelling, because this is a film and it does unfold in time. There is a professor of literary studies at the University of Oslo named Nguyen, who in 2014 wrote a book about what storytelling is. And here's what this book is about. This book is about the following question. Like, what does it mean to tell a story? Well, one conception of telling a story is you close your eyes and you imagine some characters, and then you imagine what they would do, and you write it out, keeping up with your thoughts, you write out what they would do, and there's your book, there's your novel. There's a problem with that. My objection to that is, why would anyone ever buy such a book? Because if you just want to see characters in the world do what they would do, you don't need that. You don't need to go to the theater. You can go to the DMV and see people walk around and do their thing, or you can go to the laundromat and you can see people walk around and do their thing. So there must be something more. And what Nguyen argues is that the storyteller is actually doing the following, not simulating what characters rationally would do, but rather giving the reader these little morsels of information, again, carefully, deliberately chosen, just like the tree trunk, these two strokes that create the trunk. The storyteller chooses these plot events and actions to create in our minds as readers an experience, whether this is surprise or shock or dismay. This is also a problem I've thought about computationally for a very long time. I've thought about what it means to think about the reader's experience in a story. It turns out to be, again, very difficult to model computationally because, again, just even acting like a human is hard enough, but then to perceive the world as a human does, perceive social interactions as a human does, is harder still. And finally, to now create impressions for someone who perceives the world as a human does, that's even more challenging. But let me just say, going back to maybe that first picture on your handouts, people do this effortlessly. Alison is a highly trained filmmaker, and so for her this is easy, but even for you and me, we can tell a story if it came to it. We can draw a tree if it came to it. Again, look at them kind of looking into their cameras. You can almost imagine out of the back of Alison's head, this thought bubble kind of sprouts out. And what's in that thought bubble? Where you and I, all of us are in that thought bubble because she's imagining how we would react to that little clip of video. And of course, us in that thought bubble, we have our own thought bubbles coming out because we look at that clip and we're trying to make sense of people in that. We're kind of applying our visual perception to make sense of what we're seeing. And the characters in those thought bubbles themselves have thought bubbles. This is what I mean by common sense. There must be something shared for this not to just fall apart, for this to work and to cohere. And I just want to, I want to come back to this picture of Alison all the way on the left with her sunglasses. I think Alison in this moment is dealing with what it means to participate in the transport of light through this world. Because if you really take a moment to understand what it means for us to be thinking about each other, thinking about each other, thinking about each other, these thought bubbles inside each other, common sense, it can be overwhelming. It kind of blazes with this blindingness. And I think eye protection is important. When you're looking at that, I think that we are luminous beings and we participate in the transport of light through this world. That's all. Thank you.